European leaders gathered in Downing Street this afternoon. But the key question is, do they understand the gravity of Donald Trump's shift in his attitude to Europe? Saying that migration and censorship is leading to civilizational erasure on the continent, is Europe losing the backing of its biggest and most crucial ally? Well, let's hear now from Jim Townsend, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defence for Europe and NATO under President Obama. How worried does he think we Europeans should be about this so-called erasure?
Well, I would be worried only if you saw the administration taking steps to try to implement this kind of policy. Or is the administration giving money to opposition parties? Is the administration actually leaning forward into meddling in European domestic politics? But, you know, there's a lot of just rhetoric that comes out of this administration, as well as written bombast. And so I think we have to see just how far they're willing to go to implement something like this.
I'm sure you're right, but there is evidence, is there not, that certainly MAGA people, if not the administration, have been very close to some of the right-wing populist movements challenging traditional European governments. I'm thinking about Viktor Orban in Hungary and his people, for instance, but right across Europe.
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, if you remember, after Trump's first term, I think Steve Bannon and some of the MAGA people came over to Europe wanting to spread MAGA. Then they went to Italy and they went to Hungary. I know that. So this is something that they seem to be taken on as a bit of a crusade, if you will. And so finding that kind of language in that Europe paragraph, to me, had the fingerprints of J.D. Vance on it. And I was surprised to see it in there, frankly. But I think the authors of this document are not big strategists. And there's a lot of the philosophers of MAGA certainly had their fingers in this in terms of writing it up, and they have Europe in the crosshairs.
And you've had a long sort of overview of this relationship. How much of a turning point do you think it is for Europe? And do you think we are at a moment when we really have to think differently about our own political and military leadership?
Well, it's that's a very good question, and it's the question we're debating and discussing all through Washington right now, all the Europeanists and transatlanticists, and we're talking to our colleagues across the Atlantic about this. I think it would be a mistake to think this is a one-off. You know, we thought of Trump 1 as a one-off, and Biden was elected, and then Trump 2 came roaring back in. So this isn't a one-off. There is some bipartisan energy behind this in terms of Europe doing more. I don't think there's any bipartisan support for the culture wars of this, if you will, the erasure bit. But I think in terms of thinking differently, in terms of the transatlantic alliance, and not being so dependent on the United States, taking up more of the conventional defense of Europe. The U.S. now can focus on China. But a lot of that was muddied by this national security strategy. So, But I think it is certainly a turning point.
So this is really a moment where European leaders have said again and again that they're going to increase defense and military spending, the Germans in particular, but Britain and France as well. But this is the moment when we really have to do it, mean it, and follow it through.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, you know, it's not just defense spending, but it's filling gaps that the U.S. is going to leave. It's also the European defense industry being able to make this sustainable. It's also the Europeans being able to give Ukraine the weapons they need. So there is a hard job ahead for the allies, particularly because there were discussions in the Pentagon, according to news reports, where NATO officials were told by Pentagon officials that they have till about 2027 to get their ducks in a row, and that the U.S. was going to step back from the alliance in terms of defense planning. Defense planning is the heart and soul of what NATO does. It organizes NATO's defense. If the U.S. is going to step back from that, that's even more pressure on Europe given a very short timeline to try to fill gaps that might be left by the U.S.
You mentioned Ukraine just now, and of course President Zelensky is here in London. And in a sense, the German, French and British leaders are kind of putting an arm around him after Trump was again very, very bitterly critical of him for not having read the peace plan, he alleges. So this moment for Ukraine, clearly they're struggling on the battlefield. They're having a very, very hard time. It's a big morale problem, is it not, if President Trump indicates that he is about to walk away?
Well, it is, and we've heard that from the soldiers on the front lines. They've done interviews in the past, both with UK and US media, and we've heard them talk about that. But I think, in conjunction with the national security strategy, where the administration gave in to some of the Putin demands, not enlarging NATO, there's also a commentary about what we would call the future of the European security structure, and listening to Russian views and trying to have stability between the U.S., Europe, and Russia. There were a lot of things in there that was music to Putin's ears. Yeah. And it's going to make it harder for Zelensky to remain firm and stand if the U.S. and Russia are already marching ahead, certainly rhetorically, in lockstep. This is a crisis time right now for Zelensky. Over and above the past couple of months of crises, this is a real one.
And it's very hard to tell from the outside exactly what they're talking about, but it appears that the issue now is how much land and where to give up to Russia to let these talks go ahead. The danger, presumably, for Ukraine is that if it gives up too much, it's giving away its own defensive lines. And in other words, it's making it easier for Russia to go further later on if they want to.
Right, and that is tied right into the security guarantee, which is another area I think they're having trouble with too. So if in fact they do give up these defensive positions, as you point out, if that's going to be part of it, the other part has got to be a very strong Ukraine military, not a Ukraine military capped at a certain number. And there's got to be some robust guarantees that are actionable that come from the coalition, the willing, as well as from the United States. And I think it's the U.S. side of this that Zelensky wants to nail down. So what does this mean in terms of the U.S. role in security guarantees? Is it going to be Article 5 like? Is it going to be something where the U.S. is going to actually have pre-positioned equipment in Ukraine, maybe, or its troops in Germany might have that as a mission? I mean, how secure is this U.S. role in the security guarantee?
Well, that's absolutely the crucial thing. I'm moving really from defense strategy to psychology at this point. But it's been strange that at this moment in the endless negotiations, Trump seems to be leaning back again towards Putin, because Putin has given him absolutely nothing and has stonewalled and stonewalled and stonewalled. And yet Trump seems to be leaning his way again.
Well, it's you're right. And it kind of makes you wonder if that's where he has been all along. Every now and then coming up with something that's pro-Ukraine, or remember the big meetings that they had in Washington after the Alaska summit. All the European the major European heads of state and government were there around the table, and things looked like Trump was leaning towards Zelensky and leaning towards a potential victory. Remember, he had even talked about that. But then, like you said, he goes back to Russia. This time is different because when you pair up what was said in the national security strategy that was against Europe, that was pro-Russian, and on top of that, there are two tweets that came from the Deputy Secretary of State, who was quite raw, talking about to the Europeans, you can't be both in NATO and the EU. It's one or the other. You can't wear both hats. Trying to make the case that the EU is anti-U.S. while in NATO they're pro-U.S. And how can you have it both ways? And as well as these Pentagon talks that raise this idea of some type of final date 2 years from now, when the Europeans need to have everything wrapped up and ready for conventional defense of Europe. So you put those together, and I don't see Trump flipping back towards Zelensky anytime soon.
This feels like a very dangerous time for this part of the world coming. Not a particularly cheering conversation, but an absolutely essential one, Mr. Thompson. Thank you very much indeed for that.